Hello, hi, what's up? It's me, Karen, your favorite booktuber. I also happen to have a newsletter. In case you didn't know that, I would love if you subscribed. But today we are here to discuss the books that I read in March. I read 16 books in March. Honestly, one too many. And most of those books were as a result of the International Booker long list. I did make a dedicated long-ass video about the books that I read for that, so bear with me if once I get to those books, I'm a little, not as verbose about those books, but whatever, who cares. The first book that I read in March was Into Siberia, George Kennan's epic journey through the brutal frozen heart of Russia. This book was awesome. Hands down, best book I read all month. This is a nonfiction book looking at George Kennan and his foray into Siberia. This book is looking at George Kennan, his childhood, what made him become an explorer, and how he got to Russia, his first trip, and then the second one that's a bit bigger. So during his first trip, he is someone who's quite fascinated by Russia and comes back to America speaking very highly of the country, and in particular, their habit of exile and how that's actually the most humane way to dole out punishment. And that's his party line, I guess you could say. And he goes back to the States and he's speaking about this, but for some reason, and I forget the exact reason why, he decides to do more research onto the penal system. So he goes back to Russia and he's traveling through Siberia. He has his pal with him who ends up having a mental breakdown in the midst of their travels. And because of the time that he spends in Siberia, the second trip, this is the one that's the main focus of this book, he completely alters America's relationship to Russia and also plays a big role in highlighting how whack the system of exile was, and really underscores how it was actually quite inhumane and cruel and horrible. And so for so many reasons, this book is really fascinating. One, it really gives us this a deeper understanding on how our current relationship with Russia, like how we got there, because Americans at the time thought really highly of Russia, and George Kennan's work really, because after he comes back from Russia, he ends up going on these like world tours, not world tours, but like stateside tours, where he's talking about his experiences. He would get dressed up in the garb of exile and just really go into it. And I don't think I've done a good job of explaining why you should read it, but I really recommend it because obviously it's really great nature and travel writing. George Kennan was traveling through Siberia, like on sleds, with dogs, with horses, and crazy things happen in these kind of intense weather conditions. Like sometimes they lost travelers and they had to go find them. And these travels were like covered in snow and just some really wild conditions. And it's a really thrilling read in that regards. Like I wouldn't expect that I would be someone who would be interested in the minutiae of traveling through Siberia, but I was with it and so down, and was so inspired by this book that I started looking at photos of George Kennan's travels in like Russia during that time, and it was a really fabulous read. And George Kennan also ends up finding a lot more about the political dissidents, because those were a majority, or like I guess you could say maybe half, I'm making up the numbers, about half the people who were exiled, and he's learning more about them. He's seeing the role that women played, women from the aristocracy who were against the Russian government at the time, and the things that they would do. They were really leading this movement, and he's sharing his thoughts on that, as well as coming to grips with what it means to be brave and have integrity. And I would really recommend this book out of everything I read. I hope what I talked about made sense, because there's just so much going on in this book. It's so layered, it's so nuanced that I can't do it justice in like a 1-2 minute long clip on YouTube. But I would really recommend you check out this book. Hello, hi, what's up? We are back with an outfit change because the day that I was filming, I was being thwarted at every opportunity. Phone calls, doorbell, landscapers. Once again, there are landscapers out and about. You may hear them. It's one of the problems of living in the suburbs. Someone's always getting their lawn cut. Whatever it may be, let's dive right into it. The next book that I read after whatever it was that I was discussing beforehand was Holly Black's The Prisoner's Throne. This is part of the duology. It's the second one. Whereas in the first book, we were getting told the story from Ren's perspective, complete switch. This is told through Oak's perspective. And I personally didn't really appreciate that because I feel like in this book, a lot of the action is happening around Ren and a lot of like mystery and secrets, and instead through Oak's perspective, we as a reader are just as confused as he is, and I kind of just missed Ren. But it was fun and exciting to conclude this little section of the story, and we end up getting hints about what Holly Black's next project will be. After that, I read Mrs. Caliban by Rachel Ingalls. This is the book that, after I read Binstead Safari and I was checking out the reviews, a lot of people were talking about this one and how this is the better book of Rachel Ingalls. And I don't know if it's just because of the fact that I read Binstead Safari first and then this one. I just really appreciated that one because I feel like it had a bit more levity to it and humor, and I was like swept away in the story a little bit more. This is slimmer and a little bit more surreal because how it starts is that we're introduced to our main character. She is a housewife and she's very unhappy because her husband is not a nice guy. And very early in the very beginning of the novel, she ends up taking in a monster who is on the run, on the loose, because he killed 2 of the men who were holding him captive. And so she's falling in love with this aquatic fish man entity. And through him, you're able to the narrator's like telling him more about humanity and what it means to live in this world. And he's watching television and seeing dance and all these things. And he has such interesting questions. And so through that, you're able to reveal things about humanity because you have the other trying to learn more. But at the same time, this book is very slim, comes to a bit of an explosive ending. And it just left me wanting more, I guess you could say. I think that this is similar in the sense that Rachel Ingalls is someone who takes her characters, women who have things stacked against them, they are not in happy situations, and then they have a moment of an opportunity to escape their circumstances, generally through the aid of a man, and somehow they don't get a happy ending. Interesting perspective, but also at the same time it's a very harrowing one because it's not very hopeful. But I do think her work is very interesting and it leaves you with a lot of thoughts and questions, and after you read her books, you're kind of just like questioning things, and we should all be questioning things, right? After that, I started my international booker journey. First on the docket was Undiscovered. Our narrator is a woman who's trying to get to the bottom of her lineage, her heritage, trying to suss out what does it mean that she is a woman of color, but also the granddaughter. Is that how you say that? The granddaughter, great. I don't know. Those aren't the terminology that I would use, but you get what I'm saying. One of her forefathers was a European man who was traveling through Peru. And so she is trying to explore that, but also at the same time, really looking at desire, in particular her desire as a woman who is in a polyamorous relationship where she has a husband and a wife, and one would think that she has the opportunity to experience a lot of love, but actually she ends up putting herself into situations where she's really unhappy because she's often cheating on her partners. Then I'd read an audiobook, The Patient Assassin. This has a long title. It's a true tale of massacre, revenge, and India's quest for independence. This is looking at Udham Singh, who was born in Punjab, really dire circumstances, an orphan who was most likely in Amritsar, but hard to really tell, when the Jallianwala Bagh massacre occurred. And after that event, dedicates his life to killing the 2 men who were responsible for this. But he doesn't end up succeeding in killing both of them. One dies before he was able to get to him. The second one, he does kill. He was successful in doing so. But this is a really, not dense book, but there's just so much information and so much knowledge that it was a really intense read, but really informative and very important, because I think it's really easy to read history or to learn history in school and to think of them in like really siloed events, like just in a bubble almost, but that's not how history happens. These events are also happening as other things are happening in other parts of the world, which I know, like, saying that's kind of silly to say it, but sometimes it's really easy to forget it when you're studying history. And so we're seeing Udham Singh traveling to the States. He's in California. He's getting involved with the Ghadar movement there. He's also traveling through Russia and like getting involved with the communists. And it's so fascinating, but at the same time, so much is not known about him. But I think our author did a great job of giving us what we do know and really painting a picture of who Udam was. He was a really complicated man and someone who was charming, but also kind of had this streak of like self-destruction. So sometimes he would be really close to moving forward in his goal, his one big goal, but then would fuck it up by doing something really stupid. But it was a really like moving read. You also learn a lot about what the British officers were doing in Punjab and the violence that they were enacting, which was really gruesome and tough to read at times. Next up on the docket, we had Crooked Plow. This is a look at tenant farmers and blends sort of magical realism situation with social realism. We're focused on these two sisters who as children were playing with a knife and shit happened. One of them cut their tongue off, and as a result of that, the two sisters are deeply connected as children, where the older sister, the one who could still speak, becomes the mouthpiece for the younger sister. So part one, we're getting a lay of the land. We're figuring out what it looks like to be a tenant farmer or the descendant of tenant farmers, and how tough that life is when you don't earn a wage, you can't even build your own house, you have so few options. And then part two takes us through the perspective of the younger sister, and she's now a woman. She is in a relationship that's not very good, and you're seeing how the land has changed, and then things kind of culminate in the third part, which is told through the perspective of a spiritual entity. And I think that this was an interesting book in that it gives us a lot in story. Like the first half is really engrossing, but then the second half gets a little bit too, I want to use the word didactic, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily the right word. It's just started to feel a bit like a history lesson and not as engaging. Then I read A Dictator Calls, another one of those IB books. This is a story. This is not a story. This is more so like creative nonfiction, where our author is looking at when Stalin called a poet asking about the fate of another poet, and then the poet that was not on the phone ended up dying. And so you're seeing this conversation and the ramifications that it had as this conversation is then retold through the various people who were players in society at that time. So you're kind of looking at the literary people of the time. It's not a book for everyone. Then I read The Silver Bone. This is a mystery novel that made it onto the International Booker long list. I think this is really like easy to read. It is the story of a young man who becomes an orphan very quickly into the book. In addition, his ear is cut off, and this ear now becomes a magical ear. It is able to hear things when he's not in the room, and he's trying to get to the bottom of a plot, but the action really doesn't happen until the last 40-50 pages, and you're kind of just seeing the chaos of what it's like to be a civilian during this time when there's so much political turmoil in the city. And what does it look like when members of the army can come in and just take over your house or confiscate things for the government, and there's like salt shortages and sugar shortages and stuff like that. If you're a fan of this author, I think you'd probably like this book. Okay, after that, I read The Extinction of Irena Ray. This is a book about translators and their messy, messy lives. What happens when 8 or 9 translators are in a remote village in Poland when their beloved author disappears, and like, what do they do? And you'll see that this is not a book for people who like logic, because these authors are not, these translators are not very logical. They lose the plot once their author disappears, and they end up creating a shrine to her. They are dressing up as characters from her novels in a weird little Halloween party. They are walking through the forest. There's also love affairs and secrets that are revealed. And I would say it's a fun book. It was really funny. I especially liked the footnotes. It's kind of hard for me to explain this book, so I just think because there's something meta happening, so I think you should just run to your bookstore or your library and grab a copy. Then I read White Nights. This was also International Booker. It's a collection of interconnected short stories that it's not linear, okay? Like sometimes you'll be in the past, sometimes you're in the future, and pretty much every story is really dark and depressing. A character dies in basically every single story. This is looking at a really remote village, generally people who are tied to the land. They have a strong connection to it, but also want to leave, but many of them aren't able to leave. I would say the language was really interesting and good. Okay, after that I read Not a River. Not a River is another one of these International Booker books, very short, fragmentary, and also a little confusing because you're flipping through so many different points of view and you're getting a deep dive into masculinity. You have these three characters who are kind of on a bit of a boys' weekend, and they're going to this little village that is close to a lake, and while they're there they make the locals mad and things happen, things spiral a little bit, and towards the end it gets a little bit like has a fairy tale quality, which I personally really appreciated and enjoyed, but I don't think it's for everyone in that regards. After that I read Kairos. Guess what? Another International Booker book. This one is looking at an age gap relationship between a 19-year-old girl and a 50-year-old man who has a lot of secrets. And this is also, you know, I'm gonna be honest, I think their relationship naturally is not good. It gets abusive, it is toxic, it is dark, and it drags on for way too long. However, the relationship is there to act as a sort of metaphor for the relationship between East and West Berlin, and that's kind of the point of it. Like, it's supposed to be a bad relationship, and I do wish we got like a little bit more about the GDR and their realities, but I think that this book is really interesting and something that I've like find myself returning back to and thinking more about and reading about, and so I'm really happy I read this one. After that I read Of Cattle and Men, which is a book that is shortlisted for the Republic of Consciousness Prize for small presses. This is a story of men and cattle, as the title says, Of Cattle and Men. This is looking at a slaughterhouse. We're going deep dive into the lived day-to-day realities of these men and how much death and destruction is around them, and kind of as a nature of their job, they value life, but they're also really callous about life. And someone could die, someone could disappear, and it's kind of just does not faze these people. Very quickly in the novel, we get the vibe that something's acting up. The cattle are acting up. They are acting weird. And our narrator is this man who's kind of he's really good at his job, but he's also a bit of a loner, and he does have a desire to escape this job because this job is really draining and grueling. At the same time, he also has a really interesting relationship to God, which I thought was something I loved teasing throughout this book and learning more about. My only complaint about this book, and I kind of think that if you're gonna complain about a book, this is a great one to give. I wish this book was longer. I wish we got more. And if that had happened, I don't think the ending would have wrapped up as nicely as it did. And I would have loved that because I do think this book could have just been really sprawling and interesting, and I just wish we really went there. Next up, I read The Details. This is a book that I just like keep on forgetting that I read this book, and I think that's so unfortunate because it was shortlisted for International Booker, but like when I was looking at the list of books that I read right now, I'm just like, what the fuck was this book? It's just so forgettable for some reason. But obviously you might have a really different experience of the book. So what is this book about? You're wondering. The Details is really short. Our narrator she's got a fever, and through this like haze of the fever, she is looking back at all the people in her life that she's lost. The first person is her roommate, a former roommate, or a former friend. I don't know, because you know, if you watch my International Booker long video, I talked about how I didn't remember who the first person was in the first chapter, but then I was like driving and it came to me, but now I've forgotten it again, and I'm so sorry for that tangent. Anyways, that's one person. Another is a former lover, and it's really like smooth writing, I think, on the memoir side of things, because there were kind of a few of the books that were giving like an autofiction memoir-y kind of vibe. This one had the strongest writing, but it was a really nice read in the moment, but as we can tell, it did not stick with me for the long run. After that, I read another one of those international booker books. I read What I'd Rather Not Think About. This is a really compulsive read, really short, snappy, really small chapters that you just sit down and it's hard to put the book down. It's looking at twins, a boy and a girl, and we learn very quickly that the boy committed suicide and the remaining sibling is kind of grappling with grief and looking back at their childhood, their early 20s, etc. And she's also sharing details about their relationship with their parents. This is an interesting read, but at the same time, there were like moments of pop culture. Well, that was a weird little shoulder movement that I didn't really appreciate because I'm not a fan of Survivor. I've never watched the show. I'm not interested in this narrator's wiki deep dives. Like, just in those regards, it didn't really vibe with me, but I think it was moving. I liked it. The final book that I read in the month of March was also International Booker. It was Lost on Me. And I made this joke in that other video. I'm going to have to do it again. It was Lost on Me, why this was longlisted. This is a book that is looking at a woman who doesn't like responsibility and wants to escape her family, but kind of has a hard time doing both. And she's looking back at her childhood and her teenage years and the early 20s and just living life, except the final book that I read was Lost on Me. This was also for International Booker. This is autofiction playing with truth, and it's supposed to be really like funny, but I think I found myself more embarrassed for our protagonist. I don't know, I just wasn't charmed by this book. I think it was meant to be like really funny and light and frothy, but I just don't think I was vibing with it. So yeah, that's this video. I think that when I read International Booker, my wrap up kind of takes a big hit because I find myself just so done with the whole thing, but we are done. I'm pretty sure we're done. I don't think I'm going to read Mater, which was shortlisted. I might read this one, The House on Via whatever, because I do have a copy, but I think I would take my time with, actually, I don't know if I'm going to read this because I'm going to be traveling soon. Anyways, we're rambling. I would love to know what you read in March. Any great books, International Booker, thoughts, vibes, whatever it may be, let me know. If you made it this far, thank you so much. And even if you didn't, thank you. But you probably wouldn't have seen this. And I'll see you in the next video.